With common sense for the Commonwealth, it's the John Fredericks Morning Show. Like us on Facebook. Follow John on the new Twitter handle @JF Radio Show. And online, the website, thejohnfredericsshow.com. Listen online anywhere, anytime at washingtontimes.com/listen. And make a note of the new call-in number, toll-free at 888-480-JOHN. That's 888-480-5646.
I think people forget now what a groundbreaking figure she was, not just for women, though certainly for women, but as the first female Prime Minister, and as an absolutely conviction politician who saw a problem and was determined to solve it, whatever the difficulties might be.
It was the Russians that thought they were insulting her by giving her that title back in 1976. But Margaret loved it and used it relentlessly herself in speeches.
It transformed Britain. No doubt about it. Of course, there were painful problems as a result of this. Unemployment soared, partly because of an international recession too. But she broke decisively with it, and she put Britain on a different road.
I remember way back when you and Ronnie first met, and there was an instant rapport. You both shared your convictions and philosophies, and from then on, you were partners, allies and friends, and Ronnie was your biggest fan.
The 10th commandment, thou shalt not covet, recognizes that making money and owning things could become selfish activities. But it's not the creation of wealth that is wrong, but love of money for its own sake. The spiritual dimension comes in deciding what one does with the wealth.
Words of St. Francis of Assisi, which I think are really just particularly apt at the moment. Where there is discord, may we bring harmony. Where there is error, may we bring truth. Where there is doubt, may we bring faith. And where there is despair, may we bring hope.
Now, with common sense for the Commonwealth, here's John Fredericks. And John, I have the honor to introduce to you the former Chief of Staff to the British Prime Minister David Cameron. Alex Deane is with us this morning as we remember the life and good deeds of Margaret Thatcher. Good morning, Mr. Deane. Thank you so much for being with us.
No, thank you.
Absolutely. John?
You know, Mr. Deane, it's great to have you on from the position that you have. And as we look back at this, in the 1970s, the British Conservative Party, much like the Republican Party of today, was wayward, lost. And when Conservative Prime Minister Ted Heath took over, as I recall as a young man, and we talked about free market principles, but then
he never delivered on them.
No, he implemented a cornucopia of what I would call liberal statist policies. I remember income controls, price controls. He abandoned his call for labor union reforms and ended up directing subsidies for his industry pals.
Correct.
He nationalized companies like Rolls-Royce. From your perspective, how did Maggie Thatcher come in and turn that around?
Well, she, as you've correctly portrayed, a damning picture of a pre-Thatcher era in which both sides of the aisle believed in managed decline. That was their agenda for my country. We're going to manage our decline into second-rate status. And she simply didn't accept it. She would often say, I am not a consensus politician, I am a conviction politician. How different that sounds to many of our political leaders today. And she simply set herself on a path where she was going to change the agenda by force of will and belief in her convictions. I so admired her.
Mr. Deane, I understand that she actually carried in her handbag a quote from Abraham Lincoln that said, you cannot strengthen the weak by weakening the strong. You cannot bring about prosperity by discouraging thrift, and you cannot help the wage earner by pulling down the wage payer. You actually had quite a bit of interplay with Margaret Thatcher before working for David Cameron. Can you tell us what kind of woman was she in private?
She was a woman of considerable charm. I remember friends of mine would always be, understandably, tongue-tied on meeting her for the first time. And she was always at pains to set people at their ease. Remember that she didn't have any grand background. She was the daughter of a grocer, She was very much, she'd come up as a working woman. She had very little airs and graces and pretensions. She believed in getting things done, and that manifested itself in her private life as well as in her public life. She was an honest and open, straightforward woman. At one time, a guy I introduced to her for the first time, very tongue-tied, managed to stutter out, "You saved our country," after a long pause. And she said, with a beautiful smile, "I agree."
Wow. For someone who had such compassion for the people she served, she certainly had quite a strong hand in international affairs. And as we heard in that montage coming into the segment, the Russians gave her the name, the Iron Lady, and she owned that phrase quite often in her own speeches.
Absolutely. And not only the Russians had that sense of admiration. One of the things that pleases me is listening to the views of the millions of people in Eastern Europe who she, along with Ronald Reagan, who we so admired, helped to liberate from oppression during and after the Cold War. And they are unabashed in their enthusiasm for her in a way that many of us conservatives in the UK are unabashed in our enthusiasm for Ronald Reagan. Her respect and belief in the primacy of the individual to make choices for him or herself and to have more or his or her money and let the state get out of the way and let people get on with their lives, manifested itself across every aspect of her being. And that sense of individual responsibility and trust in the individual meant that it was authentic. And it attracted votes that usually would not have flowed to the Conservative Party and haven't since, and delivered huge electoral victories for her. And I think that there are significant lessons to be learned from that example, both here in the United States and at home in the UK.
You know, Alex, one of the probably what I would call the untold footnotes of history is when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait. And I remember reading that President George Bush, at the time, had called her up, wringing his hands, didn't know what to do. And she had this famous line on the UK-US hotline to him where she said, "Now, George, this is no time to get wobbly."
Exactly. There speaks the woman. And, you mentioned Edward Heath, who was a dreadful man who I had the misfortune to meet in person as well. And Edward Heath, who was a real sellout of everything that he had been elected for and a sellout of the Conservative cause, he would have wobbled. And not just because he was immensely fat, he would have wobbled on this. You needed a Margaret to have that certainty and that conviction. And boy, when she had an equal like Ronald Reagan, then they strode the world like colossi, and they changed the world. But when she had people around her who were less solid and more wobbly, she stiffened their resolve. And thank God for her, we will not see her like again.
As we played that opening montage, we also heard the words of Nancy Reagan, who remembered the first time she met Margaret Thatcher. And from that point forward, is it true that the Reagans and the Thatchers were almost like an extended family to each other?
They were very close. That is true. I mean, there was a point of awkwardness around the Falklands conflict, which shouldn't be overlooked, and I know historians won't overlook it. More, I gather, from the State Department's reluctance to support Britain's resolve to secure the Falklands than anything that Reagan felt personally. But like any president, he has advisors, and one is inclined to listen to the advisors you have around you. But absent that example, I think that it was a tremendously close relationship, one that never meant that either side betrayed their cause. Both Reagan and Thatcher, rightly, great patriots and admirers and believers in their country, but they were very close. And I think that Reagan understood her mission to, as my Prime Minister said yesterday, make Britain stand tall again. She restored a sense of pride in my country, which I'm proud to say I believe to be great and a country that I love, but that was in the doldrums and in real despair before she arrived. Reagan saw that and understood her mission in a way that less generous characters and less self-confident characters might not have done.
Now, Alex, for those in our audience that don't necessarily understand the intriguing nuances of UK politics, can you explain to us why in 1990 she actually got beat?
Right. Well, she wasn't, let's remember, she was never beaten by the electorate.
Right.
She was unique in delivering larger majority governments once in power, so her majority, once she got in, kept going up at elections.
Right.
She was removed from power by members of my party, the Conservative Party, in Parliament, who felt that she had become a liability. And no doubt she'd been there for more than 10 years, and she was not the high performer that she had been. But, she was more than the equal of any of those who stuck the knife in and removed her from office. And it just went to show that for years to come, people were still looking to this figure that they had removed for advice and leadership and guidance. We wound up with a compromise leader, John Major, who's not a bad guy, but it was by no measure her equal. And we... because we'd been through that bloodletting process, we denied ourselves probably more able leaders, someone like Michael Heseltine, or indeed the younger generation of leaders, William Hague, who got broken on the back of a defeated general election when he became leader too soon. So we disrupted our entire generation of leaders by betraying Thatcher and removing her from office, which we did as a Conservative Party.
And what's interesting is if you go back in history, essentially the same thing happened to Winston Churchill.
Yeah, that's correct. And our two greatest leaders. We have this form of words that is often adopted in the UK to allow us to sidestep comparing the two. We normally say that Thatcher was our greatest peacetime Prime Minister. I actually think she was probably just our greatest Prime Minister, but you're right. We decapitated Churchill too and removed him from the leadership without the voice of the people really speaking. But unlike Thatcher, Churchill, who was a real political survivor, of course, and changed parties and struggled for decades, Churchill had lost general elections. Thatcher is unique as a leader in that she assumed the leadership. She was constantly underrated. She was constantly underestimated, but she never, once she was put to the people, lost a general election. And that, I think, is a tribute to her abilities.
Mr. Deane, as the former Chief of Staff to Prime Minister David Cameron, how did Mr. Cameron feel about Mrs. Thatcher?
Oh, a great admirer, in the same way that so he and our Chancellor of the Exchequer, which is like our Treasurer, George Osborne, he and George Osborne have been rightly lavish in their praise for Margaret Thatcher. My Prime Minister David Cameron spoke about how she didn't just lead our country, she saved our country, which I think is no overestimation of her contribution. But of course, we've got to remember they must have felt, they did feel and do feel, they were slightly in her shadow. And George Osborne, so our number 2 in government, has been frank enough to admit that today. He said we should embrace the fact that we are in her shadow rather than try to deny it.
Well, the one thing that really stood out, of course, is that she inherited an awful situation there in Great Britain, but she did not use it as an excuse, and I think that's a benchmark of a great leader like Mrs. Thatcher. If you could impart maybe a personal story, since you met her several times, what would be a lasting memory for you?
Oh, I remember more than anything her patience and gentleness with those who were vulnerable. Alfred Sherman was an advisor of hers and fell out of favor, as advisors sometimes do, and had his own kind of wilderness years once she was in government, and became increasingly disillusioned and outspoken. And so it was with no expectation that Thatcher would have anything to do with it that I went to Alfred Sherman's last book launch very shortly before he died. And yet, there in a very small room, in a little think tank headquarters, Margaret Thatcher turned up. And there were maybe 20 of us gathered around this old man of failing health, and she was so attentive. She was deferential to the man whose book launch she had come to attend. She was the star of our nation, but that day he was the star of the show. And she helped him and held his arm and was content to and proud to play second fiddle to someone who had, over the years, I think it's fair to say, been rather mean to her because he'd felt fallen out of government favour. That was the measure of the woman, and that's the woman that I choose to remember.
Now, Alex, in light of her passing yesterday, of course, many of the liberal elite in the United States, I don't know about the UK, but they've come out on Twitter and other social media with just vicious attacks.
Well, judge her by her enemies, guys. You know, I'm sad to say Twitter is alive with people gloating and rejoicing at the death of this old lady. This class act. I mean, she never stooped to the depths that they are now. Well, how brave it is to insult the memory of a dead old woman.
Yeah, and quite frankly, the behavior on MSNBC here in the States to turn the death of Margaret Thatcher into a symposium on Hillary Clinton in 2016 yesterday was shameful, to say the least.
It is just unbelievable. I mean, she's been dead for less than 24 hours, and the reaction of some people to immediately... we have an MP in the UK called George Galloway, who's a far-left figure, who tweeted, "Tramp the dirt down," was his reaction within an hour of Margaret Thatcher's death.
We have had the honor of speaking to the former Chief of Staff to British Prime Minister David Cameron, Alex Deane. I can't thank you enough for the time. I know John feels the same. Your insight is precious, and quite frankly, I've always thought that for anyone going into politics, they would do well to study the life and politics of Margaret Thatcher. Even though she may not be a U.S. politician, she certainly had a global impact.
Thanks for having me, guys. Great to be with you.
Absolutely.
Thanks, Alex.
Thank you so much. We appreciate the time. That was just brilliant on his part. Some great insight, and obviously having worked for Prime Minister David Cameron, he met Margaret Thatcher a number of times, and we were glad to have him on the program. My goodness.
Steve, I remember in 1979 when Thatcher got elected, the polls, I believe, were very close, so that was not fait accompli. I remember picking up, I was in New York at the time, as a young man. I remember picking up the Times and seeing on the front page her victory and thinking to myself that perhaps it's a precursor to electing Ronald Reagan in 1980 in the United States, which it's turned out to be. But as far as MSNBC and some of these other, some of the deplorable tweets and comments that I've seen, this is the thing. Liberals have no shame. And why, as conservatives, we are getting beat by the far left wing is because they are simply nastier and tougher. They take no prisoners. They don't care. And as conservatives, we try to take a civil approach to life. And the battle that we're in with the far left in the United States is one I don't think right now that conservatives are on the same playing field with. I mean, you read some of the vile that has come out from these people, and it's just it just makes your skin crawl, Steve.
It does, and she came to light, as did President Reagan, at a time, a very dark time in our national history. She promoted principle above expediency, which was a benchmark. Of course, she turned around a terrible economy, as did President Reagan, and not by more government programs or stimulus, but by less. And the odd thing was, she openly supported American ideals, which in this world economy, in this global sense here, I don't think you find too many doing that these days. So for those who want to hearken back to the 80s and 90s and so forth and say, well, you can't have that old school kind of politics anymore, I say hogwash. You can have it, especially with people as principled and as loving to their constituents as Mrs. Thatcher and, of course, as President Reagan.
Well, many Republicans today like to wrap themselves around the Ronald Reagan flag, but I can tell you that Margaret Thatcher makes me proud to be a conservative. She stood for something. She believed in something. She got results. She didn't back down, but she also did that with tremendous grace. And what we need in this world is a lot more Maggie Thatchers and a lot less Chris Matthews. This is the John Frederick Show.